Okay, the topic of this talk is why do Americans have more lung cancer than the Japanese? More lung cancer death. Between 1950 to 1985, Japan and USA both smoked a lot of cigarettes. The Japanese actually smoked more than the Americans did, but the Americans had more than, about 2 times as many deaths. Here's a paper summarizing this work, and here it shows mortality per 100,000 was about 38 deaths in the Japanese, about 72 in the Americans. What they found is the Americans were eating a lot more dietary fat. The Americans were eating between 40 to 44% fat. The Japanese started out when they were eating a primarily rice-based diet, like from 1950 through about 1975, eating about 8% or fewer of their calories. So less than 10%, we'll call that a very low-fat diet. And, towards 1985, they're getting up to 24.5. That's the whole problem with the Japanese health, is that they started more westernization of their diet. They're getting a lot fatter and sicker and more demented. So why do the Americans have so many more deaths? Well, they initially thought it was because of the animal fat, and it might be because the animal fat is going to cause decreased oxygen delivery to the tissues, and we talked about that before. When Otto Warburg, the German biochemist, lowered the oxygen delivery to tissue cultures by 35% or more, he started getting transformation of cells into cancer. Some, of course, die, go into apoptosis. But so when you increase dietary fat, you're causing a relative hypoxia of the tissues. Let's say in the ballpark 15 to 20%. You superimpose upon that the tobacco smoke, relative hypoxia, the carbon monoxide in the cigarette smoke. You're making those cells relatively hypoxic. So you're tipping the patient over the edge with a high-fat diet. Could also be the animal protein contributing. We talked about it. China study book by T. Colin Campbell. When you increase animal protein, he found he could turn cancer on and off by increasing animal protein from 5% baseline with casein, the milk protein, versus 20%. When he gave 20%, almost all the animals would get cancer, versus when he kept the animal protein 5% or less, none of them would get cancer. So he felt that the percentage of animal protein in the diet was the most important controlling variable for whether or not the animals would get cancer, working especially with mice and rats, and he said that's been confirmed with other types of cancers, and he was working with liver cancer at that time. Other relevant things. There's also more iron when you're eating a largely meat-based diet, plus we have a lot of iron fortification, if you will, of the grains in the United States, and a lot of people are taking iron in their vitamin supplements and stuff like Geritol and all that. Air pollution didn't seem to be the deal. The Japanese smoked more cigarettes than the American. Migration studies, show that doesn't appear to be the deal either. So let me just get the next slide here. Okay, here it is. This is just showing the big difference in the curve of lung cancer for the Japanese versus the Americans. And they had a real high percentage. They had higher percentage of persons smoking in Japan than they did in USA. So that's another even further thing suggesting, well, how come the Japanese don't get as much lung cancer as the Americans? All right, then there's another population that's interesting. I don't have the actual paper. I couldn't find it. But Papua New Guinea, they eat, tons of sweet potatoes. They used to be eating about 93% of their calories from sweet potato, which would mean a very low percent of protein in their diet total. It was in the ballpark for around 4%, close to what Walter Kempner was feeding his patients with the rice diet in North Carolina, in Durham. And so what's interesting is the Papua New Guinea population only had about a 1% death rate from lung cancer, whereas the comparable numbers in the United States, these are from 2020 from the World Health Organization, was 6.2. So 6 times higher death rate. Now, I realize I don't have the paper comparing the exact cigarette smoke. And this is sort of hearsay because I've heard in the past that there was a dramatic increase in lung cancer death in Americans compared with Papua New Guinea, despite some similarity, and they're both smoking a lot. So I can't give you better numbers. This is the best I got, but you see there's a dramatic difference there. So that's kind of interesting. And what's the point of all this? The hypoxia as well as the animal protein growth promoter effects appear to be the reason, as best we can tell from what I've known. And I've heard a lecture on this in the distant past, I'm recalling it. That seems to be the best explanation. And I think that's interesting. I think that's relevant. And this also pushes more towards the genetic theory, not explaining it, but the metabolic theory having a bigger effect. So the high-fat diet was more potent than was just the cigarettes. So that's interesting.